Hi, this is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and I'm joined here today by a special guest, Dr. Erin Roberts, Associate Professor and Chair, or is it Assistant Professor? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Professor and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at University of South Carolina. Dr. Roberts is a specialist in early Christian history and Hellenistic moral philosophy and method and theory in the study of religion. And she's here today to talk to us about her favorite gospel, Gospel of Matthew. She's writing a book about and has been studying for a decade or more. And she just told us all that in the first take of our video that we failed to record. So I'm just speeding through that. And we're going to get started with an interview today about the Gospel of Matthew. So, Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start by just asking you the most basic question about the Gospel of Matthew, which is, how much do we know about the author of this gospel? Was it really written by someone named Matthew, a disciple of Jesus? So who was the author of the book, and what kind of person was he or she?
The answer, I mean, you've probably talked to your class about this to some extent, but the answer is fairly complicated. It's simple and it's complicated. The simple answer is we don't know who this person is. But I mean, my version of the more complicated answer is that asking that question, I think, raises a bunch of other questions for us. And I guess the first question that I ask myself when I'm asking myself who the author was is, why do I want to know that? And I think that's a good opportunity, for us to notice that we already assume a lot of things about the relationship between authors and texts. But it boils down, in my mind, to the relationship between any kind of producer and a product, right? And there are different ways to conceptualize that relationship. So if we think about the relationship between a producer and a product as, kind of an expressive relationship, like the product is an expression of the producer's like sincerely held beliefs or perceptions or memories, then we're going to treat that text or that product a little differently than if we think about that relationship as maybe in a more kind of rhetorical or even capitalistic sense, which I'm not sure we should do for antiquity, but instead of being an expression of the author's beliefs, we could see it as maybe an attempt to persuade other people to behave certain ways or to do certain things. So I know I'm not answering your question yet about who this author was, but what I'm trying to do is to say that question, I think, can be best answered by looking at the text itself and trying to figure out whose interests are being served, not only within the story in the text, but also by potential readers of that text. These Gospels in the New Testament are anonymous. As I'm sure your students know, nobody's name is signed to them. And I was just looking yesterday at a really nice article by Daniel Alucci. It's about anonymity in the Gospels, kata Pac-Man. And he talks about anonymity in different contexts. He talks about kind of in the 80s, these video games were so popular. Think about Pac-Man and all the spin-offs. Nobody knows who made that game. I mean, he does, and a lot of people do, but nobody cares who wrote it or who designed it. And he says we really need to think about the Gospels in a similar way, right? That, instead of looking for a particular person, we might be able to think in terms of social types. What type of person could have written it? What kind of education? Where were they in the social hierarchy? What was their social situation, their social domain? So, that's a really long way to say, I'm not ready to say who wrote it, but I am ready to say maybe what kind of person wrote it, or at least consider a few different social types and then talk about which seems more likely than the other and why. So
that sounds like a great reframe for the question. So I'd like to just reframe it then. So what kind of person wrote Matthew for what kind of people?
Yeah, and again, it's not an easy answer, and to be honest, I kind of have I have two working theories about this. And they may not be mutually exclusive. They may be compatible with each other. And, as you can tell, I take a materialistic approach. I'm viewing this as a product made by, a producer for consumers. We don't know much about the early consumption or, use of this gospel. That was one of your questions. We do know some about it. But I guess my starting point is the text itself. And I'm viewing it not as necessarily an expression of kind of true or sincere belief, but as a rhetorical piece. I'm viewing it as a product that was constructed possibly to persuade people to do certain things. Jesus is the main character, and he's given a lot of authority in this story. He's given divine authority in the story, right? So basically, his teachings are equated with God's will. And in the Gospel of Matthew, his teachings are said to bring great rewards in heaven or punishments in hell if you don't follow them. So, for those reasons alone, I think we can say fairly securely that it is a rhetorical piece, or at least it has rhetorical parts to it. The question then would be the content of the teachings that are being promoted throughout the gospel. And if we think about time period of the first century, kind of the early Roman Empire, and we think about the fact that Rome at the end of the first century, or a little before the end of the first century, conquered Judea and did make something of it. We have coins and we have writings about how good it was that Rome conquered Judea and kind of submitted those uncivilized people to better, more moral ways. If we look at Jesus's teachings in Matthew compared to what, say, Tacitus had to say about that event, we can see some similarities. And I think that helps us make some guesses about whose interests were being served through its writing or through its consumption. Just one example, Tacitus says that it was a really good thing that the Romans did conquer Judea because, as he says, Moses was kind of a trickster and a charlatan, and Moses's laws, the Jewish ancestral teachings and laws were actually causing people to go astray and to be bad people who lacked self-control. He said they were lazy, as evidenced by their practice of the Sabbath. He had lots of bad things to say about them. And he thinks that, the Romans coming in and bringing their ways would actually help those people, which is, of course, a rhetorical move. But the interesting thing is that in Matthew, whoever that author is, has Jesus teaching certain kinds of virtues that would make people into good Roman citizens. For example, we can take the Sermon on the Mount, which teaches against retaliation. It says, don't have anger. It says, don't fight back. It says, if you're abused, be happy about it. So in a way, those virtues that the hero of the story is promoting are virtues of submission, right? They're virtues that can help you live a better life as an oppressed person, right? If you know your place in the hierarchy and you don't try to get ahead of yourself. So in one way, it's teaching the virtues for a certain social class of people in an empire, right? So it might be in somebody's interest, if you are an oppressed person, to follow these guidelines. So in one way we could say, well, maybe it was somebody who was sympathetic with the Jews. Maybe it was somebody sympathetic with their position and wanted them to be able to kind of survive in some way, in the early empire. On the other hand, though, I could totally see how somebody like a Tacitus, may have written something like this to try to prevent revolts. If you knew that people already were interested in this Jesus figure and you had Jesus teaching these virtues of submission and, accepting abuse and violence, then, the ethnicity of the person, I don't think, can be determined. I'm sure your students know, though, that, literacy and certain kinds of writing practices would be exclusive to a certain set of people because of money, education, training, access to different materials. But yeah, so I mean, I have these two theories that I'm thinking about. One is that it could have been generated by some Roman elites, somebody like a Tacitus who was interested in preserving the hierarchy, or could have been a Judean who was interested in something similar, but for slightly different reasons.
If I understand you correctly, Dr. Roberts, you're saying that this most likely produced by someone whose interests are tied with the elite and who is promoting essentially a quietistic ethic of submission inside a context of imperial domination. Is that about right?
I think it's right, but I would also say it does protect the interests of the elite, but I don't think that means it had to have been produced by the elite. Right? People who are oppressed, or people who are kind of keeping in their place, oftentimes they desire to do that. So, just because it promotes the interests of the elite doesn't mean that the elite are promoting those particular interests. It could be the oppressed people who are doing it as well. And I'm not sure how to decide, which is better. And I think it may, for now, at least for me, be better to just keep those options both as possibilities. Yeah.
Do you see this book as having emerged before or after the Roman conquest of Judea in the Jewish War and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE?
Sorry, I'm just making a note of something to mention.
And I was wondering whether or not that would impact the urgency of the teaching to be submissive to violent authority and things like that. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's complicated because, what we know about writing practices and what we know from the text of Matthew itself is that this was not, somebody just didn't sit down and say, here's the genealogy, and they just wrote it front to back without any other material. So we do know that whoever wrote this had, at least some collections of sayings at their disposal. Whether they were sayings of Jesus or not, is questionable. We do know this person had a version of the Gospel of Mark. And we know that the Gospel of Mark, we seem to think that the Gospel of Mark contains, pieces that do come prior to the destruction and the conquest of Jerusalem. So, when we think about ancient writing practices, the question of dating is complicated because people could be drawing on materials that were produced, before a certain period, say before this conquest happened, but then they're reformulating them after the fact, maybe for different purposes. I tend to think that what we have now, the Gospel of Matthew as we have it now, was produced after that conquest happened. It just seems to fit with a lot of the Roman literature of the post-conquest period, as far as the moral teachings go. I'm willing to change my mind, but that's just kind of my theory for now.
Okay, so let's assume for argument's sake that it was written sometime after the conquest, and you mentioned it could have been written by a Judean or someone very sympathetic to the Judean position under Rome, or not, and it's hard to determine. But what do you think is the reason? Well, no, let me skip that question and just go right to the next one. For the average reader of Matthew, whether they're in a church or even in a college classroom, they're going to pick up the text and it's going to start with the genealogy, and it's going to present Jesus as the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham, and then tell all these stories about his life and his work, and also share a bunch of teachings. And the impression that the text gives is that it's just telling you about Jesus. In other words, we would call that historical. We would say it gives an historical impression. It seems to be telling you the history of Jesus. And my question for you is really, how historical is the Gospel of Matthew, and how much should we think about it as its presentation of Jesus as just something accurate that we could rely on to let us know who Jesus was in history?
Yeah, this is another big question. This is something I was thinking about a lot last night and this morning. 'Cause I saw that you might ask something about this. This overlaps with the study of the historical Jesus, which is kind of an empire unto itself. I feel like if we read kind of with the grain of the genre, of the ancient genre, then I would be prepared to say, yes, this is 100% historical, as is Mark, as is Luke, as is John, as is, Manetho's accounts of Moses.
Can they all be 100% historical?
What I mean is that they can all be claimed as such for particular reasons, and be accepted as such for particular reasons. I'm really grappling with this idea that, that we can that we can reconstruct precisely what happened. I honestly don't know where I stand with that. And I know this is a theoretical problem. Is it discourse all the way down? Do we just have claims about history? Do we not have history itself? How can we know it? I think it's so complicated. Take Q, for example. Matthew's use of Q, or even if there weren't a Q, whatever material that is. That some people do argue, and I'm quite convinced that some of those sayings that were attributed to Jesus may originally have been attributed to John the Baptist. And there is a lot of overlap between those two figures. And John the Baptist in Matthew and in Luke has already become submissive to the Jesus program somehow, right? He's a forerunner. He no longer has really his own message. In Matthew, Jesus picks up John's Matthew verbatim. Right? Verbatim. He takes it over.
Yeah.
So,
Claire Child definitely argues that
yes,
traditions have been reattributed to Jesus and that they maybe even all or part of Q originates in that circle.
Yeah, and right, she is who I'm thinking of, and that book really changed the way I thought about things. Most of my training has been in history of thought and philosophy, and concepts and rhetoric, and every time I look at like the criteria of the historical Jesus group, which I'm now on the steering committee of, oddly enough, I don't know what to do with those criteria of authenticity, criteria of embarrassment. I mean, I honestly don't buy a lot of that stuff. So I'm right in the middle of thinking about, how to even begin to answer your question about history. I'm fully prepared to say that, the rhetorical force of this history written by this person we call Matthew is claimed to be absolutely true without a doubt. And that goes with the grain of ancient history writing. And to be honest, that also goes with the grain of contemporary history writing, right? Like if we look at what's going on around the world right now, you can just flip from news station to news station and you get completely different pictures, right?
That is true.
It is kind of a postmodern thing to say, we can't tell what's true, we're bombarded with all this information, but we've got 4 different gospels right there in the canon. So the answer is, I don't know. I'm just rambling now.
Well, the question emerges for, I think, historically in the West for 2 reasons. One is that the story that Matthew tells is filled with events that are also present in the other gospels that are hard to believe from a modern point of view, whether we're talking about the resurrection of a dead man at the end, or the miraculous healings throughout, or walking on water, or in Matthew's particular case, a scene that's only found in Matthew of the dead in Jerusalem rising at the moment of Jesus's death on the cross,
right.
Coming out from their graves into the city after the resurrection. So there's that, but then there's also just the bare fact that the same teachings that are present in Luke are in different order than are present in Matthew. And it looks, I think, to an unbiased reader, it looks as though Matthew has carefully crafted a presentation of Jesus using materials and is not paid attention to what a modern historian would pay attention to in terms of laying out a careful chronology of events and making sure that everything is really happened just as it did, that Matthew has some other aim in mind,
Right.
moral instruction, for example, or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would agree, and I think it's even bigger than that. I mean, I'm kind of toying with the idea that at the very end of Matthew, you know, they're all gathered around the resurrected Christ, and he says, "Look, go out to all the nations and teach them exactly what I've taught you, and baptize them in the name of the Spirit, or in my name, I think." Anyway, the interesting thing is, here's here's a Judean hero telling all his students to go out through the empire to all the nations and to teach what he's taught them through the gospel, which in effect is Roman philosophical practices, right? The practices of the Roman Stoic, like the mental practices and the self-control. So I mean, so I'm really thinking that maybe one of the claims, one of the things that's happening in this gospel, is that there's almost like a claim to the origins of this kind of morality happening. You know, so not only in addition to saying, yes, do these morals, but also, oh, hey, look who innovated them. This Judean hero who actually properly interpreted the ancestral, you know, laws of the Judeans. So in a way, it's kind of, in light of the propaganda against Moses, if we think about the Sermon on the Mount, the part where he's talking about, you know, the interpretations of the law, it's almost as if Matthew's Judean hero, Jesus, is almost rehabilitating these laws and kind of showing, like, actually, if you look at the true meaning, they do blend well with these, you know, Roman ideals. And then at the end, he sends his disciples out almost as if, like, Jesus is the one responsible for those virtues, you know, being popular around the empire. Anyway, you said there may be a lot of things going on, and that seems to be another one of them, in addition to the morality. Yeah.
Well, forgive me for maybe imputing views to you that you don't have, but it sounds like you're saying that one possible reason why Matthew might have been constructed as it is to sort of, I don't know, to give a Judean origin story to classical Roman and Greco-Roman moral thought as well, to sort of like recast moral thinking around the Roman Empire as a Judean heritage. And that makes me think that you're advocating more of the that it originated with a Judean who sought to defend or apologize for Judean traditions in terms of by showing how compatible they were, even superior to the way they were portrayed by Romans and to Roman thinking itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what it sounded like I said, and it may be probably what I said. But I would clarify that I'm trying, and I think I need to be, like, more clear about it. I'm trying to draw a line between possible function of the text on the one hand and the possible motives or reasons for writing on the other. And there may be further distinctions to be made, but, you know, it does seem to me that the story can function that way, to function as kind of an origin story. You know, whether that author did it on purpose or not, I don't know, and I don't know how I would know. Yeah, so in a way, it could be saying things like, yeah, you know, it was there, you know, latent in the Judean laws all along, and now it's freshly revealed through this person called Jesus. And look, just like Romulus, he rose up from the dead, so now he's our awesome founder figure. We have one too.
Well, let me ask you the next question on my list.
On the other hand, though, you know, it doesn't mean that, you know, a Jew has to write a story about Jews. Like, you know, we can write stories about anything we want. So anyway, sorry.
Well, would it be a sort of form of Roman Orientalism then, perhaps, if it's a Roman who is pointing to a Judean origin or Judean superiority in terms of moral thinking, etc.?
Could be, yeah. Yeah, could be. And
That's
you
it.
know, something else I can't get out of my mind is Celsus's later critique, saying, you know, he does point out that Jesus says things that Plato said previously, but he says that Jesus said them in a very rough form, like not very eloquent at all. And I can't get this idea out of my mind that I'm pretty sure Robin Walsh planted there, is that in some way that this could be satire or even comedy, right? That we have these really eloquent Greek teachings, and then here comes this kind of rough and ready Judean figure who's like kind of alluding to them, but not very eloquently. It's just there are just so many possibilities. I'd rather just lay out the various options. I don't know where I stand on that point. Yeah, anyway.
Well, I'd like to ask you what we know about the first people who used the Gospel of Matthew. Once it was written, and as Plato points out, a text, once it's written, kind of leaves the nursery of its author and then wanders around the world and gets used in different ways. And I'm wondering about the early users of the Gospel of Matthew. What kind of uses did they make of this book, and what did they think it was? What did they think it was for, and what did they do with it?
Yeah, well, this is one of those questions I was going to pass on. I mean, you know, one thing I could say would have to do with Augustine, and you know, he was kind of the first to look at the Sermon on the Mount as a set of moral teachings unto itself, right? So he saw at least part of this text as strictly for moral instruction. Previous to that, I'm not ready to say much. I mean, there's an interesting book by David Jorgensen. I think it's called Treasure Hidden in a Field, and he talks about how the Valentinians, if I'm correct, were some of the earliest interpreters of Matthew. And I could be mistaken on that. I tried to look it up last night, but
Well, we also know that Origen had an entire commentary on Matthew and made a lot of it in his sermons. And so it's clear that by the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, people were using it as a source for preaching in community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a question I'd like to talk about later, probably. Yeah, I need that to bake more.
That's fine. Well, maybe I could reframe the question just slightly, and you might have a little more to say, and then I'll let it live. The question might be then, like, what makes it so difficult for us to know how it was used, what uses it was put to by its earliest community?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one complicating factor for me is the contemporary notion that Christianity is like this religion of a book, this kind of textually based, we carry around our Bibles and that's how we share the message and that's how we learn about God, kind of religion. I think one of the things that's hard for me and hard for a lot of people is to get that notion, you know, out of the mind. You know, instead of thinking of early Christians as like carrying this book around and sharing it as gospel, right? I mean, I tend to go with a lot of the redescribing people and to think that it was the literary production itself that played a very big hand in producing the movement. That still doesn't answer your question.
Well, I do find it curious that we have so little evidence of any kind of the earliest readers, how they read. I mean, I remember seeing in the Acts of Peter where he is portrayed as stumbling into a meeting where they're reading the gospel, but then the response of the author, this is in Actus Virtulensis chapter 20, where the response of the author, or of Peter, I should say, seems to be, you guys are reading this book wrong. Let me show you how we read it. And then he essentially reenacts the transfiguration scene for this gathered group of people. He recreates the great light that had appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, which is apparently the scene they were reading in the gospel. It suggests on the one hand that there were communities that sat together and read the gospels and used them to reflect on their traditions or their ideas about uh, behavior or practice or whatever, but it also suggests that there were critics of relying on the text who wanted to do things in a more immediate way or in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I tend, and again, this gets back to the way contemporary Christianity shapes our construction of the past. But I really am not on board with this idea that the gospel is an expression of sincere belief, and that a community was sitting around reflecting on it, like, you know, thinking about their lost but now risen and dwelling in heaven former leader of some sort. I don't know. In Jesus Christ Superstar, there's this scene where I think they just finished the Last Supper, and they all start singing about, you know, wish that I could be an apostle. Like, when I retire, I will write the Gospels, and they'll all talk about me when I die. It's like they're writing because they remember fondly these memories, and they're writing so that they can remember it. I'm just not sure that's what these books were about or used for. I'm not answering your question well, probably, but.
That's right. Well, we'll have to return to the question of
Yeah,
why books were
yeah.
used at some point, and maybe in another context. Well, let me ask you then the next question on my list, which is, what kind of long-term effects did the Gospel of Matthew have on the ideas of later Christians or the practices of later Christians? And how have our contemporary ideas even about Jesus been influenced by Matthew's Gospel?
Yeah, I mean, if I could answer that kind of, I'd like to lump that kind of with the next two questions that you sent me. Kind of, you know, how is it still interesting today? But I think that includes the impact.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
If you don't mind. But the first is, you know, this thing about ethics. Matthew is the first of the Gospels about Jesus that really makes him into a teacher of ethics. You know, full force. And the Sermon on the Mount is kind of considered, well, it is considered by people to be, you know, the heart of Christian ethics, or kind of the originary moment of Christian ethics. And I think one of the interesting things is that people view it this way, as if these ethics are kind of timeless, and as if they're universal, and that's just what good people do. I feel like we keep coming back to that in that way, or at least, you know, Christians do, because that's what they want to be true. When in fact, as I already mentioned, these are ethics that are deeply embedded within and supportive of empire. And I think I'm with Burton Mack when I say that I'm not sure that this is the kind of ethic that, you know, a modern liberal democracy, you know, wants to have as its founding ethic. I'm not sure that we want to be promoting that universal ethics are those of hierarchy and empire. You know, that's one thing that just continues to kind of bother me. And, you know, when we hear, oh, this is a Christian nation and this is a democracy where everybody equally has a voice, you know, when you look at this kind of founding speech of Christian ethics, this is not a democracy at all, right? This is, you're going to get abused, suck it up, and be happy about it. And I think that's really interesting to me, how that thread has just been rewoven and recast in different ways to keep it relevant.
So it strikes me that your reading of them, I'm not here to disagree with you at all or to argue these points. Noticing that, you know, there's a whole tradition of interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount that comes more out of a radical Quaker or liberationist point of view. I'm thinking of Walter Wink and others who argue that it's that there's a inspiration for anti-imperial action embedded in Jesus' ethic. And you obviously don't find that persuasive at all. And I'm just curious about whether you have any quick way of framing that disagreement with that interpretation of these.
I mean, as far as the Sermon on the Mount goes, I would love to have that conversation in a little more depth and kind of look at the passages. But I mean, even to the point of surveillance, I think it's in the Sermon on the Mount. Like, Matthew 6, the Father sees in secret. He sees everything you do. He sees the motives of your heart. This is a very controlling God. I mean, this is a God kind of like the Stoic God, who's very nosy and who's like all up in your business, and he cares what you're doing. This to me seems very top down, very imperial, like from the very, very top. Yeah, so I would be interested. I think that would be a fascinating conversation. But yeah, maybe I've just been jaded by by looking at it over and over again. But yeah, I find it really difficult to see how it could be anti-imperial. Yeah, actually, that Father sees in secret. That was the other thing that I think is interesting. Then I just had one more thought. But the kind of the current cognitive science studies about moral behavior and getting people to behave the way you like. There are studies that do say that people will follow directions better if they've been primed with a concept of an omniscient punishing God, not an omniscient forgiving God. And the God in Matthew is punitive, probably more than the others. I mean, there's talk of outer darkness and throwing into hell and Gehenna and fire and gnashing of teeth, more than once.
Yeah, there's a pretty clear hell concept in Matthew. And
yeah.
there is also just, this reminds me of the TV show The Path. Have you ever seen The Path?
No.
Well, it's about a phenomenon, and their primary symbol is they have use an eye that they mount on the wall of every room where there does any work, and it's this divine, all-seeing eye. And knows it? Is it knows it? I can't remember who's the author of Big Gods.
Yeah, that's the book I'm thinking of.
The argument is.
Yeah, I don't have it here. But.
Yeah, the argument is that surveillance deities are a part of the development of hierarchical, contemporary, well-organized civilizations, and certainly there's studies, cognitive studies, that show that if you can put out a bowl of money, and if you put a large picture of eyes by it, people won't take the money out of the bowl just from the drawing of eyes near it.
Yeah, all it takes is a pair of eyes somewhere, or even just something looking like eyes.
So, but I think that's probably pretty unsettling for a lot of Christians to think of Matthew as presenting a big brother deity that's in service of political hierarchy. And you have, well, so my last question was, is there anything we can learn from reading the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew that would be especially helpful for us during this time of COVID-19 and quarantine 2020? And now here we are on Zoom, being watched by the great internet oracle, recording ourselves. You're making me very nervous.
I mean, I did think about this question, and to be honest, the first thing that came to mind was something that may sound unusual, given what I've been saying so far. And, and that is also Matthew 6, about, anxiety and the future and things like that. I mean, I'm not promoting any particular view of a God or even a view of a God, but I mean, there are some things in Matthew that can be very cognitively and emotionally helpful. Especially the idea of anxiety and worrying about tomorrow, and just kind of focusing on the moment, and just kind of trusting that you can do what you can do, in a way that this sounds kind of like a cliche, but I do think there's something profound about it, and it is really easy to get worried about the surveillance, this seeing eye and the hierarchy. But when I thought about this question, it also concerned me.
Telling us what to do. We have to stay home. We have to stay indoors.
Right.
We have to go out. We can't see each other.
Right. That's the other thing I thought about. I thought, well, here I am saying, maybe empire isn't that great a thing. But then here I am at home. And so I guess I'm thinking the other thing is there's a difference maybe between this kind of absolute power and sending to hell on the one hand, and kind of a hierarchy of expertise on the other. I mean, I very much am interested in what Dr. Fauci says, not because, of like, I don't know, money or economic prestige, but, because he's an expert in what he does. And so, I too am tied up in this hierarchy thing. I don't know where that's going. Just, yeah.
Well, I think that it's fascinating to try to think about the connections. And I too find a lot of comfort in contemplating the ethical instructions and recommendations that are found in Matthew 6. In fact, I turn to that material almost daily myself, to be honest. So that's interesting that we can see that same sort of resource in that. I'm going to just go ahead and close our meeting together and just I'm so thankful to you, Erin, for sharing your time with us today and your expertise and your thoughts. And I'm going to invite Ebony to ask any follow-up questions she might have before we turn off the recorder and stop, or we can stop the recorder and then you could ask. It's up to you, Ebony.
Yeah, I would just say thank you, Matthew. And, I'm sorry if I was kind of rambling. For me, it's a little early, but yeah.
Not at all. See, this is why I invited you, because then you get to be the